Well, my name is Leslie Cunningham, and I'm a documentary filmmaker currently living in Durham, North Carolina. And I'm working on a wonderful documentary project about my family's legacy. And it's about a traveling show called Harlem in Havana, where my grandmother performed exotic dance.
She performed chorus style dance. She ultimately, in the early 1940s, became the lead dancer, and she was considered an exotic dancer in the 1940s and 50s. She ultimately ended up moving to LA and working with the likes of Sammy Davis Jr. And she sort of lived her life out in LA, and that's how I was raised in LA. But ultimately, she came back to Tampa, Florida, where the show was headquartered, and she lives in a retirement home right now. And we've got wonderful, amazing stories and pictures. And the inspiration really was my father, John Cunningham. He's a Latin musician, and he was raised on this carnival show. My grandmother had him in the 40s on this carnival show, and he was raised on the show. And so he's writing a book today about his time on the show. And so he inspired me. I was going through documentary film school at Duke University here in Durham, and he really inspired me to really look deeper into my history. I mean, we didn't talk about this show when I was growing up. I knew my grandmother was a dancer. I knew my aunts, her sisters, were dancers. I knew they were on a show. That's sort of all I knew. I was sort of disinterested in my family legacy for a long time. There were a lot of weird family secrets going on, and folks weren't talking.
And Leslie, were you ever even a performer yourself? So this was sort of just like another world to you.
Another world. I mean, I am not a burlesque dancer. I love to dance, first of all, but I'm not a burlesque dancer. But I believe it's in my bloodline. I mean, my grandmother taught me to respect the art of exotic dance, of striptease. And, I decided to go on this journey 10 years ago to figure out what was Harlem in Havana. Harlem in Havana is the name of the show that she performed on. And come to find out, Harlem in Havana was created and produced by my paternal grandfather. His name was Leon Claxton, and he's a great African-American impresario who created this Black and Cuban stage review, and it became one of America's most successful traveling shows during the 20th century, during Jim Crow times. And it significantly impacted Black and Latin entertainment in ways that still resonate today. So I know that's a lot.
No, it's a lot, but I think for a lot of us burlesque performers that, sometimes struggle to see the why of, why we're doing this. Is anybody else getting a little feedback? No? Okay. Well, a lot of us who are struggling with the why of why we do this, I think it's beautiful to think that maybe someone in our family will become inspired by the things that we've done years and years and years from now. So even if we don't feel the deeper connection now, I think that familial history is really, really beautiful. And it goes even deeper than just your grandfather and your grandmother, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the Bates sisters?
Yeah, so again, my grandmother, Shirley Bates, she was the youngest of three sisters from Kansas City, Missouri. And they were raised, I would imagine, in the 20s. My grandmother said they would go down and look in the window of the Cotton Club and watch the dancers at the Cotton Club, and they would have their hands up on the window. They couldn't get in. But my grandmother said she was a gifted dancer from an early age, and she taught her older sisters how to dance. That's what she said. It was a time, I think, there weren't a lot of opportunities for Black women, for African-American women. And I think a lot of, vaudeville was happening and early burlesque was happening. And I think a lot of folks were getting themselves an act, and they were hitting the road and going to Chicago, where Black entertainment was booming, and they were getting on burlesque shows and vaudeville shows, and then there was this other set of shows traveling shows. And we don't talk a lot about the carnival stage and how it influenced Black entertainment, but there was you know, outdoor shows, the outdoor show world was the center of popular culture before television. So we're talking about long before television, when Blacks and whites were separated. You know, we were in great relations with Cuba. It was a different time. And right after World War II, there was like an international age happening in America. And, you know, the doors were open to Cuba. And my grandfather Claxton had a lot of connection, and he was creative enough to put these two cultures together. I would say that it was sort of the beginning of multicultural arts. And he would bring these Cuban dancers and musicians, and he would bring the African-American dancers. And my grandmother said it was like a nightclub show. It was like an hour-long extravaganza. This thing was very high caliber. It was likened to a Las Vegas style review, or, you know, Florence Ziegfeld's, you know, shows in Broadway. It was very high caliber. So for him to be an African-American producer, producing these levels of shows, I have probably over 300 articles from, you know, old Billboard magazines, and, you know, that said that this show was considered the best example of a show under a tent that's traveling across America, despite the color. They didn't even mention color. They just said it was the best show ever. So,
and I have two follow-up questions on that, because that's so amazing. I like that you note in the book that while this, you call it a midway show, these, you know, these giant, you know, this giant caliber of show, while this was happening, it was one tent away from many of the names of burlesque legends who, should I say, get mentioned a lot more than many of the other brown skin showgirls. So this was right a tent away from Sally Rand, a tent away from where Gypsy Rose Lee was performing at the same time, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so just imagine the midway. There weren't a lot of rides in the 30s and 40s, or 50s, really. There weren't a lot of rides. There was a lot of food. There was a midway, they called it. And let me back up. I have to give credit to Royal American Shows, which is the carnival exhibition that the Harlem and Havana Revue played on. So Royal American Shows traveled, again, through the US and Western Canada. They had all types of acts. They had animal acts and freak shows, and, you know, the midway was lined with live shows because they didn't have a lot of games or rides and things like that. So that's where you went to get your entertainment. Every time the carnival came to town, everyone made a beeline for the midway, because that's where all the dancers, all the women, you know, at the end of the midway was the adult show, you know. And so Harlem and Havana was at the end of the midway, and they were known for their voluptuous, you know, brown skin showgirls, you know, and at the end of the midway was, you know, Gypsy Rose Lee and Sally Rand. And so they were right next door to the biggest burlesque entertainers around, and they were competing for box office right there with them. And then up the midway was Elvis Presley, and he was, I read somewhere that he loved the Harlem and Havana show so much that after his show, he would encourage his own audiences to go and see the Harlem and Havana Revue. So it was a huge deal. It, in addition to the women, which is what we're talking about here today, because it was known for being a girl show, but it also showcased some of the top entertainers that we know today. For example, Chuck Berry has performed on the show. Folks like Red Fox, people when they were in their youth that started performing sort of got their start on this touring carnival review, and then they went on to the world of television when television became big. But Dinah Washington, so there were so many huge names that came from shows like Harlem and Havana, and once television became popular, they just took their shows right onto television. So yeah.
So I love that even back then, this was innovative. I mean, today, I think still we struggle sometimes to bridge gaps over oceans. You know, we're always trying to find community as Black showgirls, as a Black performance community, show people, since, you know, this is all genders, all, you know, but we're all trying to find this community together. And I love that your grandfather was able to make that connection with Cuba.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite photos in the book is of well, one of my favorite photo sets is of the Cuban dancing dolls. I love their photographs. And there was one particular photo that, you know, showed them not in showgirl attire, but they had just gotten off the plane and they were just arriving in Tampa. And I think they all had on color coordinated suits together. And, you know, they looked so hopeful and excited. So, you know, I think just to say that, I wonder, what did your grandfather have to do to get the dancing dolls to come here? And what was that experience like for them?
Yeah, so just to tail end, to finish out the 40s, the Bates sisters, my grandmother was the lead dancer until like 1949, and then she left the show. And so we see in the 40s, there were beautiful African-American showgirls that were leading the chorus line. And then in the 50s, sort of, again, post-World War II, when Latin music and Cuban music were on the rise, specifically in New York and Harlem, we see a rise in Cuban artists on the show. And so two of the biggest artists that he brought to the show were the Cuban dancing dolls, which for some reason I can't find much information about them. I've even gone to Cuba, but I'm still digging. But they were 4 eye-catching imports direct from the Tropicana. And I believe that my grandfather had a lot of connection in Cuba. I think he knew like some of the house managers at the Tropicana. They were all in cahoots, you know, so there was a lot of palm greasing going on. There was a lot of, you know, activity, you know, happening between Cuba and, you know, so I think he knew a lot of people, and I think he was looking for talent. I understand he would go down there off season, off carnival season. He would travel the Caribbean, and it wasn't just Cuba. He was going to Haiti. I mean, he was bringing Jamaica. He was bringing back just really thorough talent from these Cuban islands and putting them on these American shows. And again, they were traveling all the way as far down as Tampa, which is where the show was based, and then they were traveling by train with the Royal American shows. They had their own train car 66. That's where all the Black folks lived, on the train. And it was a 6-month seasons, carnival season. So they were traveling by train with each other in these train cars all the way up to Western Canada, and then they'd come all the way back down. And I understand some of the Cuban dancers, you know, towards the end of the 50s, they were defecting on the trains and hiding in the trains and, you know, all this craziness around the Cuban Revolution. But after the Cuban Revolution, everything sort of changed. I understand he was politically forced, my grandfather, to change the name of the show. It was called Harlem in Havana. And no one wanted anything to do with Cuba. No one in America wanted really anything to do with Cuba around 1958, 59, when Castro, you know, led his revolution. And I read in an article that he was sort of politically, I don't know if he was politically forced or the carnival industry forced him to change the show's name. So he changed it to the Harlem Revue. And from the 1960s all the way to 67, when the show ended and he passed away, it was called the Harlem Revue. And so at the end of the book, you see the 60s come alive. You don't see a lot of Latin performers. You see a lot of African-American drag queens and strippers and, you know, still a lot of chorus line dancers. But you definitely see a shift. And it's really interesting to see the shift from the 40s to the 50s to the 60s, which I tried to sort of flow through the book.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like that it was a bit, even though, you know, we still sparkle today, you know, we don't necessarily put on the same caliber shows that we used to have. And so I want to go back to that for just a moment. You know, I think there are a lot of show people in the audience, and we want to talk about the costuming for a second. Did your grandmother, did they make their own costumes? How was that handled? And did she keep any of her costumes that you've ever seen?
Yeah, no, I don't know where the costumes went after he passed away, and you know, I don't know where a lot of the actual stuff went. There is a museum in Florida. It's a independent traveling museum, and I did some filming there for the upcoming documentary film, and they've got a lot of photos there, but still trying to figure out where did the costumes go. But my grandmother said, my grandmother being the lead dancer, she said that they would send her to Chicago and she would be the model. And there was a seamstress in Chicago, a costume maker, who would make most of the costumes, and she would be that model. And then they would make all the costumes based on her size. So she had the perfect fit, I guess. But yeah, and then towards, you know, the 50s and the 60s, a lot of the costumes were made by actually two of the performers that ended up being the bigger drag artists on the show, or they would call them female satire performers. But yeah, two gentlemen actually made a lot of the costumes. So they were making the costumes right there. Yeah.
I love that connection. I never knew that. And of course, I mean, that's still the way it is these days. The burlesque and drag communities are so close together. And I think that's a great segue. So I can ask you about Greta Garbage Garland. Can you tell us about who she was and her role in the Harlem and Havana Revue?
I will, yeah. Now, can I show pictures from the book?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I have my book here too, but I didn't want to do it. I was like, I don't want to, but absolutely.
Well, like for example, this is Faye Lawrence, and he is one of the costume designers. I don't know if you guys can see that.
Yes.
This is him fully in drag. He was one of the performers on the show. And I understand he would take his wig off and the audience would just lose their mind. But yeah. So let me show you quickly my grandma. Here's a wonderful picture of my grandmother.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. This is one of the Calypso numbers that they did. She's just absolutely stunning. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then we get to the, like I said, the 60s, where we see a lot more African-American women. These are all a lot of promotional photos that were graciously provided by Royal American Shows, but we see a lot of these wonderful photos of beautiful African-American women, light skin, dark skin, you know. But yes, so we've got, I'm looking for the picture because it's the greatest picture ever. Here we go. Greta. So this is Greta. And she was just like one of the most amazing performers in the 60s. Female impersonator. And again, they called them satire performers. I don't know if drag was not, again, these were just performance pieces back in the day, but today they're art forms. So it wasn't even called drag back in the day. You know, and so this is where that history came from. If you ever wondered, why is stripping and drag so popular? Well, these Carnival Railroad shows, as they traveled across the country, they were just dispersing, you know, this art and leaving it behind. And so many people have embraced this project. I'm getting a lot of emails from daughters and granddaughters and people saying, hey, my grandma was on that show, or I think my cousin was on that show, or, you know, so I'm just, one thing I immediately did 10 years ago was, because there was literally nothing online about this, was I created a website called the Harlem in Havana. It's called harleminhavana.com. And that's the whole multimedia documentary project. So we've got the website home, and you can go there and learn about the show. You can even listen to a song that was written by Joni Mitchell. She called the show Harlem in Havana, and it's sort of her ode to the Black burlesque experience.
Wow.
Yeah, you can read the lyrics and hear the song. And that was another
Can you say the
inspiration.
name one more time?
Joni Mitchell is well, we
The
all know
artist.
Joni.
But then the actual the title of the song is.
Is Harlem in Havana.
Oh, well, that's easy to
Yeah,
remember.
yeah. And if you go to the website harleminhavana.com, there's a link at the top to song, and you can listen to the song and read the lyrics, because she talks about Black girls dancing long and leggy, and I am assuming she's talking about my grandmother and
Absolutely.
So,
And
yeah.
we just got a question in the chat box, and I think it's really interesting. You mentioned earlier that a lot of them would, they would ride by train is how they would travel. Have you ever heard of a connection between the railroad shows, the Carnival Railroad shows, and the Pullman Porters, the Black Pullman Porters at that time? And if they have any, I'd imagine just like the jazz musicians of the time, they had a front row seat sort of to this history in the making.
That's an interesting history, the Pullman Porters. And I haven't really dived into it, but I am very interested in the particular porter who was the porter on car 66, who was the porter for the Harlem and Havana troupe. And I understand that he was a blackface comedian, like in the 1940s and 50s. You guys may not know that comedians couldn't perform out of blackface, Black comedians, until like the mid 50s. Like, you still had to be in blackface if you were a comedian. But apparently this blackface comedian got in a horrible kitchen fire and burnt his face. Horrible story. But so they made him the porter. They made him the porter on the train. And so that was his job. And apparently he was with the Harlem and Havana troupe for a very long time. But I don't have a lot of history, but I'm sure there's a lot of connection there. I have a lot of video of Pullmans on these show trains. Yeah.
So, and that kind of brings me to my next question to you. And I think something that I always advocate for is for every burlesque performer, especially Black burlesque performers in particular, but every burlesque performer to document themselves and archive their own history. Because even if we may feel low, or if we may feel, because people don't say the nicest things about strippers. So, but it's okay. So this is, really inspiring to us. And I want to ask you if there were any major challenges or difficulties that you went through in bringing this story to the public and bringing your grandmother and grandfather's story.
I think the biggest challenge was initially just not having any knowledge at all. It was like literally starting from square one, and it was like a huge puzzle, and I had to keep putting the pieces together and finding the right connections. And the biggest part of this documentary project is the film, which is coming out this fall. It's called Jig Show, Leon Claxton's Harlem and Havana. And you might say, why is it called Jig Show? Well, in the carnival world and the media of the day called any Black show, any outdoor Black show with a lot of dance, a jig show. It was just a sort of a carnival terminology. And I didn't learn that until I was sort of midway into my research. And I started looking at Billboard magazines, and they kept referring to it as a jig show. And I'm like, why do they keep calling it a jig show? So that was a big challenge for me, because of course, I took offense to it. I knew jig as being a word that was degrading to Black people. And so I immediately made the connection. But as I continued my research, I realized that this little 3-letter word just had so much political power back in the day. And it was a huge, expansive sort of entertainment history that we just don't have any knowledge about. So again, the film it looks at Leon Claxton's life and the Harlem and Havana show from the late 30s all the way through the 60s. And then of course it sort of looks at the jig show, like what that really was and how that played a role in shaping Black entertainment into what we see today. Yeah. So that was the challenge, me getting over the fact that it was called a jig show and accepting the fact that I wanted to call my film what it really was. And I know that might be painful for some people, but I got through that process. You know, other challenges as an artist are always funding and things like that. But you know, in the film, I'm having to uncover a lot of there's a lot of family stuff going on here. My grandmother, my dad, who was raised on the show, and him not really knowing that Leon Claxton was his father until after the show ended, because Leon Claxton was married to my grandmother's sister. So this producer, Leon Claxton, he basically had children by two sisters who were both dancers on his show. So if you,
a lot of burlesque producers, I know. Okay, little joke there. Just kidding.
hey, it was what it was, but it caused a lot of family challenges and a lot of secrets and a lot of silence. And so that was a big challenge, trying to, in a way that was respectful, get my grandmother to open up about this. And at 95, you know, she got on a video camera and she told me everything, you know, and so I was concerned about that challenge. And then, of course, the challenge of dealing with the Claxton side of the family, and how they, you know, just feel about the whole entire project. I guess I just want to make sure that I'm honoring my grandfather's legacy, my grandmother and my aunts. I want to make sure that I'm honoring the legacy in a way that is beautiful and helps to preserve it, you know, for future artists and future generations.
I think you're doing a great job. I mean, it's very respectful, and you know, that's a heavy balance to strike. You know, you have Black history, number one, Blackness in itself. We could spend hours discussing and talking about everything, and then on top of that, you have, you know, striptease history, burlesque history, which is notoriously difficult to find. And then on top of that, you have your family history. So, you know, a hat tip to you. I mean, thank you so much for sharing everything. And
You're welcome. Yeah. One thing I,
you know, something else that you said that really, something that, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing that I wanted to throw out just a little bit more about burlesque, because, you know, that was one aspect of the show. My aunts, my grandmother and my aunts, were at some point considered shake dancers as well. And that's sort of like an area, sort of a subculture of burlesque that we don't really talk about a lot. And so I bring that out a little bit in the film as well. And I just find that very interesting, this subculture of shake dance, which generally was women of color did shake dance. Women of color weren't even considered burlesque artists. They were either called shake dancers or they were called exotics with an S on the end, exotics. And that's how the media of the day positioned them. They were different. They were not burlesque, they were exotic. And they did this shake dance, which was rooted in like Africa and Trinidad. And it was just like a newer, more informal style of burlesque dance, but it had a lot of, you know, excitement and freedom to it. And, you know, the gyration of the hips, you know, that's what the women of color, the African-American women brought to burlesque, you know, that gyration and the bumps and the grinds. And so.
The white folks call it musicality. Oh, that was another joke. But so, I mean, and so shake dancers are very near and dear to my heart, and that's a research focus of mine. And we got a great question in the chat that said, is shake dancing like go-go dancing? And I'm very interested to hear in your research if you noticed that there was a difference, and if there was a large difference at all.
That's a really good question. I don't know about the history of go-go dancing, but I would think, you know, that shake dancing, you know, again, you know, it was popular all across America. And so I would think it, you know, informed a lot of dance genres, more informal dance genres. It was much more of an underground, you know, in the club, you know, type of thing, you know. It wasn't classy, you know, it wasn't that burlesque class that Gypsy Rose Lee brought. It was a little bit more risque. And, you know, if you consider shake dance as it was then, and you look at stripping as it is now, direct roots, direct links to it. So big ups to all the strippers and the burlesque artists. I have much respect for you. Continue to do your thing. Yeah, you've got a huge history here. So yeah.
Do you ever go to burlesque shows yourself,
I do.
modern burlesque shows?
I do. I did. Well, before COVID last year, I went to an amazing burlesque show. I live in Durham, North Carolina, and there's a lot of burlesque activity going on out here. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to see it. And I think sometimes I dream about what this jig show, what Harlem and Havana, what it could look like. And I would love to like recreate a jig show one day.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because I think that a lot of us watching, you know, and not just because of the pandemic, even before the pandemic, we were all, I think, thinking of ways to elevate as a community. What type of big shows can we have? And I don't know if Jeez Louise is in the audience. I think she is, but, you know, I think Jeez Louise puts out the Jeezy's Juke Joint.
Yeah.
And Vanessa Chevelle does Afro Tees here in Richmond. And then we've got Pearl Noir, who just did the Noir pageant. We've got What the Funk in Seattle. We've got Brown Girls Burlesque. So, and I'm trying to make sure I name all of them, or at least Melanated Menagerie. We've got, you know, Fat Bottom Cabaret. So we've got all of these little troops popping up everywhere. Chocolate Lounge in DC, right where I'm at. Give ourselves a shout out. So there are all these, you know, regional, all over the world, actually. Cocoa Butter Burlesque. I can keep going on and on in London. But one thing that we haven't done, at least on a grand scale, is put together those big types of shows that we used to have. And I think the issue that a lot of people see is that the venues don't really have the same level of respect for us. And so could you talk a little bit about your grandfather's relationships with these venues? Is it because we need to grease palms? What can we do to sort of, you know, recreate what we used to have?
Yeah. Well, first off, I mean, he was on the traveling circuit, so his show, his African American and Cuban show was sort of protected by the larger Royal American Carnival exhibition, and so that was the venue. The venue was, you know, he had a tent. It was an under the tent show, and he would set up the tent, you know, on the carnival, and so. That was his main venue, but off season, he would take his troupe and they would travel to nightclubs in Miami and, you know, all over. So they were booking shows off season. And I think it was just because of the popularity of the show that it was easy for him to bring it in. But it was also the high caliberness of the show. It was so over the top and fabulous, and the costumes, you know. So that was really rare, I think. You know, there were a lot of shows going on. There were a lot of smaller railroad shows. But I think the fact that it was so extravagant and so well done, it just couldn't be denied. And so no one was turning my grandfather down. They were booking that show, you know. But one thing I'd like to do you know, I think about COVID, but I'm not going to worry about it, because one thing I'd like to do once the film is ready is partner with a lot of these burlesque clubs. I've been getting a lot of love from the burlesque artists. We did a sort of a screening of just a sampling of the film a couple of years ago, and I hired some burlesque artists to come in and
yes, Jory Tiger Lily says hello from Richmond, Virginia. Yes,
absolutely. And so, yeah, so I've been connected with the community on this project, and I want to continue those connections after the film is done, and maybe do some collaboration on some shows and some film screenings. And so, yeah.
Okay. And how are you feeling, by the way? I hope I'm not firing off too many questions. I'm like, there's so much to talk about, so I'm trying to, you know, check in instead of just being like, tell me about this. But just to switch gears again for a moment, you said when you talked about how the word jig made you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but you still felt this powerful need to tell the story as it is. You know, this is the truth of what this is the show. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that is a Black thing, right? That's not new to us, taking terms that perhaps were once hurtful and once represented something different. we take it and we make it something that's a lot more beautiful. And there was another photo that I loved, and since I have permission to share,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so there was another photo that I love where, and we're not going to talk too much about cultural appropriation because, you know, that's a whole deeper subject. But sometimes we have a problem in modern burlesque where instead of hiring someone of a particular culture, people just do it. They say, if you know, whatever they want to perform, they just perform it without even thinking about the fact that there may be performers who are a part of that culture who would love to display it. And, you know, I love that your grandfather's review was doing this even back then. Here's a photograph of the Cuban dancing dolls doing their, is it Luchimi? Am I pronouncing that
Yes,
right?
yes, Lukumi, yeah.
Is it
I think it's Lukumi, yeah.
That they performed with the review. So I just wanted to, you know, see how, if that photograph, is that something that you got from the Royal American Company as well?
Yes, yes. All the photos in there came as from Royal American, so they were directly from the show. And that was the beauty of the show, is that they presented real African American culture, you know, real African American music and dance, and real Cuban. So, you know, the Cuban have a history of a lot of spirituality in their dance and in their music, and you know, he brought that to the show. And that picture that you just showed, I think it was part of this hour-long show. Had, you know, different, you know, they had a opening and a couple of acts, and then they had a middle and a couple of acts, and then they have the big finale. And one of the acts on the show was called The Mythical Trip to Havana. And you may not have heard of her, but Mercedes Valdez, Merceditas Valdez, she was a real good friend of Celia Cruz. And she was like one of the first Santeria singers to ever be recorded. So she had a beautiful voice. She performed on the show as well. And so Mercedes and the Cuban Dancing Dolls, you know, they came and they brought the Cuban culture. And it was beautiful. It was obviously, I spoke to one patron who said it was like nothing you had ever seen before. You're walking down the Midway and you're hearing this Cuban music blasting, and you hear nothing else because it's so loud. And you know, you hear this African American rhythm and the drumming, and then you get closer to the show and you've got Cuban showgirls, and you know, so they really prided themselves in showcasing the true culture, the true raw culture, and they were birthing new talent, new dance, new music, sort of along the way, that again, now we know as a true art form, were just like in their infancy stages of being created, you know, 50 years ago. So,
And I think that's really interesting about the Midway shows, and how I had no idea that it was set up that way, that it was almost like a blending of all cultures, especially because you could just walk down the Midway and sort of peep into different tents and experience different cultures.
yeah. Yeah, and the girl show was the biggest. It was the biggest attraction on the Midway. The girls, again, the girl show was another category of shows, and Harlem and Havana sort of fell into the jig show category and the girl show category. I've read books where, you know, it was listed as, you know, one of those top girl shows, and it really just, you know, was number one. And when I say the show was number one, y'all, I mean, I have, you know, consistent, like I said, articles and records from Royal American shows. This show was the number one show on the North American Midway for nearly 30 consecutive years in terms of revenue and audience size. So what that did was make my grandfather Tampa, Florida's first Black millionaire.
Wow.
And yeah, he was balling. He was balling. He had a lavish home on the west side of Tampa. You know, the latest cars. You know, his wife was dressed in furs. We weren't playing. They were very, very, very high class and very well known in Tampa. And his show, Harlem and Havana, actually left a real big mark on Tampa itself, because again, off season, he was booking this show in local Tampa, nightclubs and spots. So he really did help to bring that Latin and Cuban culture into the city of Tampa as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and it's so, I love that you brought that up because in my research as well, I think in general, all inclusive burlesque history, I think some folks it's debated. Some people say the golden age of burlesque was way back at the very beginning. Some people in the late 1800s. Some people say the golden age of burlesque was in the 1960s or the 1950s. I think that the golden age of Black burlesque was right at the tail end of the 1930s, all the way up until like the late 1960s. It just seems like during that time, we were thriving in a way that we aren't even really thriving today. And so, I think that it's really interesting that your grandfather's review and your grandmother, as the lead dancer of this incredibly financially lucrative business.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's
You're
we
right.
don't really hear a lot about that.
No, I think you're right. I think that time period is right, and I think I've heard in talking, because I tracked down some of the oldest living troopers to perform on this show, and I think one thing that I'm hearing from all of them is that time period that you're talking about was right at the end of the Great Depression, and you had to either dance, learn to play an instrument. You better do something to make some money and feed your family. So women, they couldn't go to college. They, had not a lot of opportunities, and dance was an opportunity for them to make money and, sort of, I want to say, take their power back. They were sort of reappropriating these stereotypes. It wasn't this was a new cool culture. It wasn't the darky show anymore on the Midway. It wasn't, the darky minstrel show where they were doing buffoonery. It wasn't that. This was a new cool culture of classy vaudeville, Blacks, and yeah, so that was the time period, and that's primarily why a lot of these women joined these shows. They had to make some money, and it was also training ground. It was a touring company, and it was a training ground. So of course they couldn't go to dance school per se. A lot of them, like my aunt, I understand my aunt was a huge Baker fan, and so a lot of them learned from each other. It was like college, going on these traveling shows. It was touring, and they were teaching each other. But then, like you said, come the 1960s, we've got feminism and civil rights, and Black women are going to college now. They don't have to just perform on these shows. So a lot of things changed in the 60s. So yeah, the heyday for Black burlesque was definitely late 30s to the early 60s. Yeah.
So, and I think it's impossible or not impossible, but I think it's very difficult for us to say now what phase that we're in. But I definitely think that there's been a huge resurgence, right? I mean, there was a time when you could count on one hand all of the Black performers that, were well known. And now, it would take you all day, maybe all week, all month, to think of every Black performer in existence today. So I definitely think we're having a boom, and I don't know what that boom means, but I can't wait to look back on this period and see where we fit in that. Because, when you were talking about why girls were doing this, it reminds me of that. There's a Jet article I like to talk about, why girls become shake dancers. I don't know. It's like the only article out there, one of the only mainstream articles, all about shake dance. And it reminds me so much of strippers today, and I'm talking strip club strippers. Some of them make a lot of money.
Yeah.
There are many places where you can really make a great, excellent living as a stripper. So there's so many correlations there between the two. Okay, and I think my next question then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's financial power. It's sexual power. It's financial power. And it's been that way, in the 30s, they didn't have a lot of financial and sexual power, and these types of shows gave them that opportunity, and I think it helped to create sort of a new confidence in African American and in women, that they could have not only, because they were getting paid on these shows, you know?
Sometimes more than we get paid today.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, see, I think the average cost sometimes is $50 an act or so. But mind you, we are also, and this brings us to my second question. Actually, let me ask you my first question before we get off this topic. What did your grandmother like to be called? Did she like to be called a showgirl, a shake dancer, a burlesque performer? What did she call herself?
That's great. And I asked her that in the film, and she explicitly said exotic dancer is what they referred to. And again, you know,
So interesting.
yeah, and looking at the articles, back that, you know, I have a lot of articles from like the Chicago Defender and Billboard magazine, which then was the outdoor amusement magazine. But in a lot of the articles in the 40s, they referred to her as an exotic dancer.
And I have to take a note on that because this is a very, very big conversation in the burlesque community right now, because the word exotic, you know, when we talk about reclaiming terms like jig or any other offensive term, some people really, really take offense to the term exotic. And these days you hear it being used almost as a divisive thing within the Black community. 50 Cent, I don't know if you know this guy. He's just some guy. I shouldn't have even said his name. He said, you know, I only date exotics. The only type of women that matter to me are exotics. And we know exactly what he meant by that statement. He meant mixed race or lighter skin, sort of racially ambiguous types of people. And that statement was so divisive, and it made the news, and people were so upset. And at the same time, there was a conversation happening on the burlesque forums online about whether we should retire the term exotic dancer.
Oh, wow.
And there is a museum that we love that a lot of us, know and love. The Burlesque Hall of Fame was originally called the Miss Exotic World Museum. And our biggest pageant in burlesque is still called Miss Exotic World. And there has been some rumbling on changing that. So what do you think your grandmother would say about disavowing that term?
Oh, no, we can't do it. You can't do it. Okay, look at this picture. Look at Grandma. This is Grandma in the middle in her exotic form. That's our history. It's our African-American history, We can't, it took me 10 years to dig up jig show. God forbid we bury exotic dancers and then 50 years later somebody has to figure out how to dig that up. Like, we've got to embrace all of it. We've got to embrace our history. And I'm hoping that this project will help, others want to start digging up some of their history as well. But, African-American history is not always pretty, and the terms are not always pretty, but there's beauty in some of those slang terms. And so we need to celebrate that beauty. In my research, I found out that jig actually comes from Shakespeare time. It has nothing to do with race. Jig means a play of dance and song. And what Shakespeare did, because he had those really heavy emotional plays, well, at the end, in order to lighten up his audience a little bit, he would have his audience come up, and some of the actors in the audience, they would play and dance together, and they called it jig time. And that's where the term came from. And I want to bring that full circle, right back to where it should be. That's what jig meant, and that's what it should mean. Of course, it devolved into this racist slur. And it's just like exotics, it has a history in our African-American, in our culture. It's a subculture of ours that we should embrace and love, so.
I think that is along the same lines of many of the other legends who feel attached to that term. I think for a time, even the term shake dancer was considered negative, because, like you said, the shake dancers were considered different from the burlesque performers. So I think now I call myself a shake dancer before I call myself a burlesque performer, and I do it as a way to reclaim that term. And I think the irony in saying, no, I'm a shake dancer first, a burlesque dancer second, I think the irony of saying that is it's me flipping it on its head, because back then I would have immediately been a shake dancer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we have to embrace all these terms. You know, even strippers who get a really bad rap today. Yeah, there was striptease on the show. Um, in a lot of the cities, it was not legal to go fully, nude. But at midnight, once the carnival died down at the end of the midway, at midnight, Claxton would do this special show that they called the Midnight Ramble. Now that wasn't just the name of his show. That was Midnight Rambles were popular all over the U.S. And there were these midnight shows, and generally they were dancers, women of color, and they were strippers, and it was whites only audiences, and they called them the Midnight Ramble. And so,
oh wait, I'm so sorry. Could you go back 1 second?
mhm,
I have never heard of that. These were Black performers,
mhm,
and it was an all-white audience.
all white audiences. And again, talk about that a little bit in the film as well. But yeah, and these rambles were huge. And so I have in the film, I actually have one of the strippers talking about her experiences on the Midnight Ramble show. But yeah, so again, striptease, exotic dance, shake dance, it's ours, and we should embrace it and celebrate it. And so that's what this project is about. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so we just got 2 questions. I actually want to back way up. I missed one question from a performer from New York named Reign Supreme. She
Okay.
asked if those headdresses that the Cuban dancing dolls wore during their religious performance, did they bring those headdresses themselves, or were those the actual religious headdresses? I think that was your question, Reign. You can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would assume they brought them. I could be wrong. They were making costumes. They were making big costumes, big time costumes. So I can't say for sure if they made them once they got to the U.S. or if they brought them with them. But it was nothing to make them because they had a lot of really talented costume designers on the show and around the show. My grandma, again, she keeps saying that it was this one woman in Chicago, but my grandmother was on the show in the 40s, and now in the 50s and the 60s. I'm assuming they had like lots of other talented designers. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Oh, gotcha. She clarified her question. She wanted to know if we wear headdresses today because of the Cuban dancers.
Yeah,
So just tracing the history of that culture. I think that's super interesting question, Rain.
it
And
is.
then another question from Eva Mystique from Washington, D.C. says, would your grandmother still be called exotic if she wasn't Cuban and was African American? So did the
Well,
exoticism come from her own culture? Would a would a non-mixed race Black performer still be called exotic
that's a
or
good
an
question.
exotic?
And just to be clear, my grandmother is African American. She's not Cuban or Latin. She's African American. She just loves the Cuban culture, and she did a lot of work with the Cuban artists on the show.
Right.
But
Oh, can I clarify one thing for the audience? So the Bates sisters were headliners. Leslie's grandmother was the lead dancer, and the Cuban dancing dolls were a separate troupe that Leslie's grandfather brought from Cuba to Tampa to travel with them throughout the U.S. and Western Canada, right?
right. So when you look at the book, I separated it in 3 acts, pretty much. 1940s, which is when the Bates sisters, my grandmother and my aunts, were sort of leading the chorus line. And there were a lot of darker skin. And here, I actually have this wonderful photo here. This is the chorus line in the 1940s. I say early 1940s, like that's my aunt right there. I think that's my grandmother right there. But this beautiful chorus line of all shades of color women. So that was the 40s, and again, once the Cuban Revolution, even before the Cuban Revolution, once the Cuban explosion of entertainment and music, again, hit New York City, hit America, that's when you began to see him changing. In fact, the show itself, it wasn't called Harlem and Havana until, it had many iterations, but he didn't name it Harlem and Havana until 1946. So that's around the time, again, when there was just a huge Cuban explosion in America for entertainment and dance, and salsa was created around that time. So, yeah.
Wow. So those stages, salsa being presented on these stages in like middle of America, probably like you said, it brought these cultures literally to places where it would not have come any other kind of way,
No other kind of way.
except your music and dance.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when you
And then
think about, just to give you the magnitude of the audience, when you think about, okay, who came to see these shows? Everybody came to see these shows, from the mayor on down, because there was no television, there was nothing to do. You know, radio had just started, right? And you know, even in the 50s through the 60s, television was around, but it was still in a very infancy stage. So it was black and white, and there weren't a lot of great programming, you know. So the outdoor show world still had, you know, still reigned as you know, the primary popular culture of the time. So yeah, everybody was coming to these shows, and then they would stay in the town for like 2 weeks. So your mama, your daddy, your grandparent, everybody went to the shows. And again, it was primarily segregated in the U.S. So they would have, they would perform for white audiences. Sometimes they would have Negro Day, and that's when the Negroes could come. And they normally was like on a Thursday, and they would take over the carnival. And so they had, you know, or sometimes they would even just put like a rope down the middle of the tent, and the whites would be on one side, the blacks would be on the others. So they had to abide by Jim Crow laws, you know, in the South, because they were performing in like Memphis and Tampa and all these other southern states. And they came against a lot of, you know, challenges performing, and sometimes they couldn't even perform at all, because they were met, the trains would be met with like rocks and bottles. And so it was a interesting time.
And then to go through all that, that's a familiar thing for us modern burlesquers, to even in the midst of political strife, the show must go on and we still perform. So I bet that must have been a huge juxtaposition to go from Jim Crow laws right outside the doors of the theater, and then this big, grand, extravagant, beautiful, gilded lifestyle, you know, on the other side. And I mean, I kind of just want to stay there. I want to stay in the theater for a second before we go back to political context. Let's stay in where it's beautiful for a second. There's a picture of your grandma in here, and I thought it was so funny. There's a picture of your grandma in here, and she is with a cow.
Yes.
So I thought about all of the crazy things that burlesquers have as props. And so I have to ask, what's the background on this picture, and does your grandmother have any stories about any crazy props that she used?
No stories. No stories. I just love it because it just really sort of, you know, symbolizes this sort of outdoor show world. I mean, I have a lot of pictures with performers, you know, posing with animals because animals were big on the carnival show. No real story behind the cow photo.
The cows were there, so the cows were used. I think that's the lesson for showgirls these days, because a lot of us are stuck in our houses, and you know, we're trying to figure out how to make the world our stage, so to speak. So I think that's very inspiring. If any of you performers out there are near any cows, you know, it's entertaining. It's entertainment. So I thought that was really interesting as well. And aside from costuming, though, did she have any props? Did she do any, like, it might be risque, but like, you know, Lily Sincere did the bathtub act. Did she ever do anything really risque, or did she keep it to the dance? Just dance, you know, maybe some mild striptease?
That was it. Yeah. Dance, and I believe some mild striptease. I mean, mostly she said that she, you know, on the Midnight Ramble, they had strippers, and then they had the exotic dancers who did not strip down to everything. It was mainly the chorus line in really skimpy clothing. And she told me in the interview that she never completely stripped. That was someone else's job, but she did wear the risque clothing, the mild exotic, and she said there were very exotic movements involved.
Can I ask a question though? So did the strippers go fully nude, or did they strip down to pasties and a G-string? Because these days, burlesque performers, we have to keep it to pasties and a G-string most
Yeah,
days at the very least. So
yeah.
were those same laws in place, or did the strippers go fully nude?
No, they didn't go fully nude. It was a law, I guess, law in most of the cities that they couldn't go
Okay.
fully nude. So here's a great photo of one of the strippers, and she does have pasties on, and
Okay.
she's got a really thin sort of lining around the waist. And my grandmother said, you know, wait, now that I think about it, she did say they would take their bras off sometimes in this midnight ramble. So I guess it was depending on what city you were in, or, you know, what they thought they could get away with. But yeah, I didn't hear it was completely nude, but I know that she did say they would take their bras off sometimes. So yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And I think, for a lot of burlesque performers who are wondering how they can document their own history or archive their own history, did your grandmother have a particular way of keeping the history, or was it all just oral and she told you her memories, through word of mouth?
She is a journaler. My grandmother is a writer. So my older sister blessed me with a journal, one of the journals that my grandmother wrote back in the 90s. You know, she just had a lot of journals, but this particular journal did document a lot of her time on the Harlem and Havana show. And so the journaling, as well as so many photos, in addition to Royal American shows, I've been given photos. My father, John Cunningham, had photos. Leon Claxton's, he had other children as well. My aunt, Gwinnett Claxton, she offered photos. So I've been just really blessed with family and institutions around that really want to help to tell the story, and they've been, donating their photos for use in the film and in the book as well. Yeah. And the book really, it's part of the multimedia project, but really it's a fundraising tool. I thought to create it because I did want another way to get the story out there, but it quickly became a fundraising vehicle for me. So, anyone it's on Amazon, it's on, you can order it on PayPal, and the money that comes in from the book sales goes right into, the film. So that's been a really important process to make sure that I have like little ancillary items in place to, in addition to the film. I wanted to have a companion piece to the film as well. So it turned out to be really nice.
Gotcha. Okay. And I think, there's a question in the chat. It says, let me scroll up here. Oh God, the chat's moving too fast. I remember the question. It was sort of like, could you wear a sheer outfit and circumvent the laws of the time? Which I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let you take it away, Leslie. Back then, could you just wear a little sheer triangle bra and say, look at me, I'm clothed? And
yeah, I think you could. I mean, because again, I'm running across a lot of pictures, and some of these pictures were actually they had a program. Each season they would come up with a new program booklet. And a lot of these pictures, I took straight from the program booklets, and it looked as if, yeah, they were getting away with a lot. I can't really say. What do you think? Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. And I think, I read a little snippet of an article that said that some performers would, they'd say you have to wear the sheer bra. You have to, but you have to wear pasties underneath the sheer bra. And some people would forego the pasties if they could get away with it. I mean, and there were other things, sneak peeks were very common back then. So I think people would sort of, do what they could get away with. But I think for a lot of the recorded video that we have, the older burlesque performers most definitely wear the sheer bra on top with the pasties underneath. But I've also seen flesh tone pasties. So there's burlesquers are known for pushing that limit as far as we can take it.
So here's a really cool picture. I don't know if you guys can see this, but if you look at the woman in the middle, she's got the pasties on. I mean, really skimpy, really, really skimpy. But she's an example. I think that's as far as they went.
Is he just that perky, or is that a bra? I don't know, jealousy.
I'm not sure.
But that's really interesting. I mean, we love the costuming has not changed that much. I mean, we love the old school type of costuming. I think even neo burlesque performers who do, you know, crazy things on stage, it's still not uncommon to see that triangle bra and that strappy thong. Those are still mainstays of, you know, burlesque. So it really hasn't changed all that much.
And
And
I think the book and the film is going to, in terms of fashion, it's really going to give the artist community just like some really rich ideas of what they were doing. A couple of local beauticians in my area got a hold of the book, and they were in love with some of the hairstyles that they saw. So I think it's just going to really inform some fashion too, as well.
yeah, that's why I think we should just keep going, because we don't even know the things that we're doing right now that will have the hugest impact later. And I think a lot of us, like one of the comments just said, I'm obsessed with the costumes.
Yes.
Yeah, we're all obsessed with the costumes. And another performer, Fanny, says when we perform in DC, we've got to wear pasties, but it's officially legal in DC for women to go topless in public. What? I didn't know that. So we have so we have to cover up more in clubs than we would legally on the street. And it's the same in New York. Gotta love policing women's bodies, huh? So that hasn't changed. The costuming hasn't changed, but that's maybe because the laws haven't changed. The laws, it sounds like they've gotten even stricter. Okay, and I think another question that I have, and this kind of blew me away. Let me see if I can find the quote. If I can't, I'll just remember it because I don't want to. Oh, here it is. Gwendolyn Bates Claxton says, oh, what did she say? I'm just going to shorten it. One year at the Minnesota State Fair, we gave 28 shows in one day. Is that normal?
Isn't that crazy? Yes.
Tired after, I do 2 acts, okay? And I'm tired. And if I have another gig after that, then do I get a crown?
Right. Yeah, no, it's true.
Do I get $15,000 for doing 2 shows in one night? 28?
28 shows. And that's generally how it went. It was hard work. It wasn't all glitz and glamour, you know, for a lot of these entertainers, because it was a lot of hard work. And the carnival, as you guys know, it starts at what, 10 a.m. and it goes to 10 p.m. most times. And so they were performing throughout the day. And it was, again, it was like an hour and a half long show. And then they would end the show, and then they would take a break, and then they would come out and do the ballet show. Now, the ballet show was, you know, that front stage to entice you to come in to the tent. And they would do a little sneak peek ballet show, and then it was right back into the hour-long show again. So they were doing back-to-back shows throughout the day, and then they would go into the night. And it was hard physical work. And a lot of the, I read a couple of interviews with some of the past art dancers who said it was just a lot of work. It was just, it was a lot of work. And some of them just decided, hey, I'm going to the nightclub. I can't do the outdoor show world anymore because it's hot. I mean, think about some of the challenges they dealt with. Weather was an issue, rain and mud and tornadoes, and you know, there were just a lot of different factors performing for that long a period of time outside. It was intense, hot, the heat, you know.
So you said these shows were, they lasted up to an hour usually?
About an hour, hour and a half.
An hour and a half. And someone else asked, would they do something like a staggering cast? So would they have separate cast in each shows, or would it be like the same cast, you know, like your grandma's dancing in every single show?
So my grandma said that it would be an opening, a middle number, and a finale. And so the dancers, the chorus line always came out with each section. So they would come out and do a great chorus style, you know, show. And then you would have your featured acts. So then they'd have featured dancer or a featured musician or a singer, tap dancers. They would have these specialty vaudeville acts that would accompany. And then once those acts were over, then the dancers would come back out, the chorus style, they would come out, new costumes and new dances. And so the chorus line was integral in sort of, keeping the show sort of moving to the end. And then, so they had feature acts in between the chorus performances.
I have a question about the chorus girls because, in a lot of my research, they get a real bad rap sometimes. It's just like, oh, and then the chorus girls. And I wonder if they could be similar to what we have in modern burlesque, which we call a stage kitten or a stage manager. Some people prefer the term stage creature, stage panther. And this is basically just a person who picks up the clothing, helps clean up in between acts, basically is the producer's right-hand person, knicker picker upper, somebody said, pick up the knickers, as the ladies dress. People drop their underwear, we pick them up. And I love kittening. Pickup artist is another term, Joe said. Thank you very much. So I wonder if the chorus girls, were they the ones who actually cleaned up in between the acts, or was that just someone else's job?
I didn't hear that,
Okay.
no, I didn't hear that from my grandmother. I got the sense that they, as chorus girls, because it was a girl show, and my grandmother was a choreographer, my aunts were choreographers, so this chorus line was very important and very big on the show. So I think they took it very seriously. And presented this chorus line. I mean, again, look at the picture. They were just
Yeah, I
beautiful.
can't imagine them on their knees,
No, I can't.
picking stuff up. And so, and Joe just said something that blew my mind as a modern performer. This shows you the generational gap. Joe just said people didn't always drop their costumes when they stripped. And there's a sort of a community famous quote from Tony Elling where she talks about how modern dancers just chunk. We have these, $1,000 costumes, and we just throw them around. We just rip them off, chunk them, lick it. We do gross stuff with our expensive costumes. And Joe is right. The performers of yesteryear would never throw their costumes on the floor. So I'd imagine maybe they just handed them off, right? Yeah, somebody
Yeah,
said they hand them off, drape it over a chair.
yeah. No, the costumes were just incredible. Like, I'm sure there was a lot of care taken, for the costumes. Yeah.
So the chorus line was treated pretty much just like performers, just like supporting cast.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the sense that I got. And then, at some point, maybe someone in that chorus line shined, and Claxton made them the leading sobre for that next season. So there was always a lead dancer, who took the lead. And again, my grandmother was that lead dancer in the good portion of the 40s. And again, the Cuban dancing dolls, they weren't a part of the chorus line. There was still another chorus line. The Cuban dancing dolls were just a featured act that came on the show in the 50s. So, but the chorus line was integral. Yeah.
Yeah, and is that a standard size, or could the chorus lines be even bigger than that? Because that's a lot of people. I mean,
Sorry.
nowadays you get a cast of 8 to 10, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah,
So,
no, I think his total cast was about 40, 50 troopers.
wow.
Yeah, it
And
was.
everybody got paid, and everybody was.
Everybody got paid. Everybody got paid.
Well, I think we're nearing down. It's almost 7:20, and so I didn't want to end this interview without talking about where Brown Skin Showgirls is heading next. And you've talked a little bit about the documentary. Is it anything you can tell us about that? Because I'm sure people are very excited.
Well, yeah. So, Brown Skin Showgirls, the book. Again, I just want to make that a companion to the film and make it available as another way to view this history. I also want to do exhibits. So I want to do a Brown Skin Showgirls exhibit. So sort of, exhibit some of the photos and have the book there as well. Just really get it out there in different ways. But yeah, the film is going to be ready in the fall. I'm really excited. I took again, 10 years I've been working on this project, and it was because I couldn't leave a stone unturned. I just wanted to find as many performers as I could. But I found myself 5 years into it losing performers. After I would interview them, they would pass away. So I just felt like I've been up against time, because if I don't hurry up and tell this story, it's going to die with the memories of the people that carry the story. So I've been up against a lot of time, and even my grandmother, who's 96, I have vowed to finish this before she passes away. And I need to hurry up, you know. I do have to say something about my fabulous grandmother. She was diagnosed with COVID a couple of months ago. She's in a nursing home, but she has been asymptomatic the whole time. They tested her like 3 or 4 times throughout the course of a couple of months or a couple of weeks. I'm not sure how long, but she continued to be asymptomatic. And the last test, she was negative. So this 96-year-old woman is amazing. And, you know, it just shows you how weird the virus is. But, you know, this woman who, from what we're hearing, it should have taken her out, but it didn't. And not only that, she didn't have one symptom at all. So, yeah, just want to hurry up and get it done so that I can honor some of the last of the living great troopers that were on the show.
That is so beautiful. And she knows all that you're doing. She knows how far it's gone. Does she know how many people are looking at her pictures and being, how many modern performers are looking at her photos and being inspired?
I don't think she has any idea. You know, she was perplexed about doing the actual interview for the film, but I think she understood that we were trying to document her life. And I took her all these photos that I found to show her, and she's really excited to see all of her old chorus line friends, and she was able to name every one of them for me. So it was just a really great experience. But no, today, I don't think she has any clue that we're celebrating her life in this way. Yeah.
That is so amazing and hilarious and funny, because she's just like in her own world, trucking along.
Yeah.
And Joe asked, would it be possible for folks to send her things, send her a card or something? Is there any way to do that?
Sure. Like maybe through my sister. My oldest sister lives in Tampa, and she's sort of the caretaker of my grandmother. And I'll talk to her and see if it's okay to get her address and share it with the group. My grandmother would love that. Unfortunately, again, no one's going in or out of the nursing homes, but when she's able to go, she would love to, I'm sure, take those beautiful gifts with her.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another question, how can we support you and this film to make sure that you're all set?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, venues like these, I really appreciate you allowing me to come here and talk about the project. I'm so excited about it. 10 years later, I'm still very excited about it. And so I just think it's a history that we need to know about. It's that subculture, that unknown African-American subculture that really had an impact on entertainment, and we still see it in ways today. So I am at the end of a long process, and you know, just if you could support by buying the book, it's available when you go to harlemanhavana.com. There's a Brown Skin Showgirls link at the top, and you can click there. And if you order through PayPal, I'll even autograph the inside of the book for you and get that out to you. It's also available on Amazon, but you won't get the autograph that way. And yeah, just stay connected to the project. I'm on Facebook, harlemanhavana.com. You can check us out there and like us and just sort of follow the progress. And then, of course, would love for everyone to see the film when it comes out. And anyone that's moving in the African-American burlesque community, please get in touch with me, because I would love to collaborate in the future.
Yeah, I think somebody, Androsia Wild in Vancouver, says that they'd love to get you and your exhibition up there post-COVID. So there's a lot of movers and shakers in here right now, and I think we can all support each other. This is a question, maybe I'll end with this question. I'll end with this question right after this. Somebody else said, how can they view the film? And I wanted you to, I know you answered that before, but just to give you a chance to say it again for those who didn't hear.
Yeah, so I'm in post-production right now, which means I have like a couple of more long weeks to go to do the final wrap-up of the film. And the goal is to get it out in the fall of 2020. It just kept getting pushed back. And of course, COVID didn't make it any better. But I'm determined to get it out here for the world to see by the fall of 2020. So it'll be available through the website. It's going to be distributed. I'm going to self-distribute the film. So it'll be available on Amazon. You'll be able to get it on a DVD or watch it on DOV. You'll be able to stream it live on your computer. And the Jig Show website is jigshow.com. That's the film website. So yeah, once you go to harlemandhavana.com, you'll be able to link to all this stuff and all of our social media. And yeah, I would just love for you guys to keep watch and support.
Gotcha. And then here's my last question, just for fun. Would you ever do burlesque or become some type of burlesque performer or producer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that was a fast answer. So my follow-up question is, what would be your burlesque name?
Well, that's a really good question. I thought about it though, and again, I can dance really well. I've been told that I'm a really good dancer, but more of a street girl in the club type of dancer. I've never taken it seriously. I've never taken a dance class, but it flows through my blood. I know, and so yes, I would definitely be a burlesque dancer. I would probably take the way that you create your drag name. I would take the first street that I ever lived on, which was Alice.
Alice.
I don't know.
I like it.
It's different, right?
And what do you think your style would be? Sorry about my son. He's getting antsy watching me do this. He's 4. But what would your style be? Would you be neo-burlesque, super modern? Would you do nerdalesque, character play?
I am a real hip hop head, so I have to incorporate the hip hop in my burlesque. Yeah.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we'll get to see that one day. And I think I don't want to go over too much, and I just made Joe the host again, and just to see if there's any housekeeping things. Is there anything else you would like to say before we end at 7:30? I wanted to let you know also that Mina Murray said in Boston that she's opening up a small burlesque museum. So there's another connection there. So I think this has just been so beautiful. Gigi Holiday is a hip hop burlesque historian. So she's already like, yes. I mean, I just can't thank you enough for taking an interest in burlesque and seeing something special in it enough to give us these gifts, because they truly are gifts. A lot of us have been feeling very low in this pandemic. It's been an extremely, extremely rough past 4 to 5 to 6 years with all of the police brutality and mass incarceration. I just think that this is a glimmer of light and a lot of hope for us.
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah,
you're helping us see ourselves in a different way.
Yeah, I really, it's a positive story, and it's a story that I think is going to help uplift our culture a little bit, uplift our people, African American people of color, who see that it is possible, to overcome the racism. It's possible to overcome. I read an article in Billboard magazine that said that Harlem and Havana was helping to ease racism in the South. That's how impactful this show was, because when the entertainers went on stage, they were so talented. At some point, the white audience, did not see color. They saw entertainment, and so they were able to change hearts and minds just by their talent. So it's a positive story, and I think it's good timing. We need a good, positive, beautiful story about the African American culture. And I just want to thank you for the platform, and thank you, Bebe, and thank you, Joe. I really appreciate you, and I hope everyone follows my work.
Thank you so much, Leslie. We cannot wait to support. We're going to be having screenings. We're going to be having little, parties. If you want to have a Zoom watch party with us, let us know. I mean, we can't wait to support. And that's the end of our interview. Thank you so much to everyone. I hope everyone is as inspired as I am. Thank you so much, Leslie. And thank you endlessly to the New York School of Burlesque and Joe Weldon. Thank you.
Thank you.